Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to this new live stream from the New Humanitarian. I'm Isabelle Roughol, and I am joined by one of our Africa co-editors, Philip Kleinfeld. Hi, Philip.
Hello, Isabel. How are you doing?
Great. And I'm so glad we're having this conversation today. We're on LinkedIn and we're on YouTube as well, so join us whichever platform you prefer. Hello, Kamal, Ali, Onur, Tafik. Oh wow, lots of people already saying hello. Let us know in the comments where you're talking to us from. So if you're not familiar, the New Humanitarian is an independent newsroom dedicated to covering humanitarian crises and keeping the aid sector accountable. And we're talking today about the crisis in Sudan and what happens next after the crisis is already falling from the headlines a month in. And Philip is talking to us from Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire. He is one of our Africa co-editors, as I mentioned, and has been coordinating our coverage in Sudan. And Philip, you were in Sudan yourself in 2021, reporting in Darfur. So I just want to, before we get started, remind people that this is a live stream, which means this is social. Please make sure to add your comments and questions in the comments and introduce yourselves, and we'll try and take as many of your questions as possible. Hello to people in Bangladesh, Nigeria, the Philippines, from Chad. Chad is going to be part of our conversation, I'm sure. So, Philip, let's start with you reminding us, please, of what is the situation in Sudan for an uninitiated audience, and why fighting broke out a month ago.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Isabel, and hello to everyone that's listening in. I'll just start by caveating it and saying, I'm not an expert on Sudan. I'm not an analyst of Sudan. Been following the situation very closely, obviously, over the last month, and been sort of leading some of our coverage over the last kind of few years at the New Humanitarian. The history behind this conflict is really very, 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 very complex. Stretches back over 100 years. I'm going to try and make things as kind of simple as I possibly can, but if you could just bear with me for a few minutes as I kind of introduce a few themes and concepts and names that might be a little bit unfamiliar, but will certainly help frame the conversation that follows. This is a conflict that opposes the two kind of main military groupings in Sudan, the two largest military groupings. So the Sudanese army, the Sudanese armed forces on the one hand, and on the other hand, the country's main paramilitary group, which is called the Rapid Support Forces, or the RSF. I think it's probably helpful just to explain a little bit about who these two fighting forces are. The Sudanese army, to start with, it's led by a guy called General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and it's played a kind of key role in Sudan for decades. And there's a couple of facts that will really help understand the Sudanese army. One is that it controls large amounts of Sudan's economy. Construction, food commodities, agriculture, all these kind of things. And for many years, a large amount of the Sudanese national budget has actually gone to the army, 70% at one stage. So it has all these kind of economic interests. Many people describe it as essentially a conglomerate, a military conglomerate. The second important fact to know is that the army, it draws its kind of leadership mainly from elites from the center of Sudan, from areas along the River Nile. And these elites that are the kind of top brass of the army are the same central elites that have also dominated Sudanese politics for decades. And this kind of this structure has created what is probably the most fundamental class and social antagonism within Sudan, which is between elites, military elites, and political elites in the center, and the country's geographical peripheries, which tend to be marginalized. Marginalized because these central elites sustain their rule by extracting and marginalizing, extracting resources from these marginalized peripheries. The second actor, the Rapid Support Forces, is one of these peripheral actors. So it's from Sudan's westernmost Darfur region, which some of you might be familiar with because of the conflict, the major armed conflict that broke out there in the early 2000s. And the Rapid Support Forces, its history, basically, it started in Darfur in the 2000s. Basically, there was an armed uprising by a sort of, the region's rebel groups who were mostly from the non-Arab communities of Darfur. And the government of the time, which was led by Omar al-Bashir, responded by arming an Arab militia, which was called the Janjaweed, colloquially known as the Janjaweed or the Devils on Horseback, to crush this revolt from non-Arab rebel groups. The Janjaweed forces committed horrifying abuses. The US called it a genocide, but they weren't punished, they were rewarded. In 2013, the Janjaweed was formalized, it was regularized, and it became an official state paramilitary group called the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces. And then a few years later, it was sort of reporting directly to the president, Omar al-Bashir, who essentially used this force to coup-proof his regime because he was worried about threats from the army, he was worried about threats from other kind of internal elements. And so he used the RSF as this kind of guard to protect him against sort of other coups. He allowed this paramilitary group, the RSF, to flourish and to grow. It got rich on gold. It started sending paramilitary fighters as mercenaries to Yemen, to Libya. It was legitimized through the EU's anti-migration control policies. And slowly but surely, it grew from a local militia in Darfur into a national force that was able to challenge the hegemony power of the Sudanese army. And what you now have is two forces representing leaders from very different parts of the country, from very different backgrounds, that are now fighting each other for control over the country. And within that history, there's a lot to learn about the danger of outsourcing counterinsurgency campaigns to militias that can then come home and come to roost, about the dangers of allowing these kind of center-periphery tensions to continue unaddressed. And this is the situation we're now in right now.
Great, and so thank you for that short history background, and thank you for that caveat to begin with. And it's great that we actually have people from Sudan in the comments, so you can keep us accountable and add your comments. And in fact, we have Wafa Bala Bashir Ahmed, who's a graduate from Khartoum University, Sudan, who's telling us, 70% of Sudan's budget went to the army and related things, and the army is not able to protect us now. So definitely some reproach there from the population. Amira says, yes, al-Bashir was always feeling threatened. So last time we heard about Sudan in a significant way. Hey, Amira says, thanks, this was very concise and insightful. So you were concerned about being too long for people. I think that was actually really, really helpful. So, but yes, last time we heard about Sudan in any meaningful way on the news in the West, on the news outside Sudan, was the protests in 2019, and this kind of wind of hope for democracy, for change in Sudan. So how did we go from there to today's street fighting in Khartoum?
Okay, another long answer that I'm going to try and be really, as concise as I possibly can be. It's really important context as well, particularly if you want to understand, a lot of the frustration and anger that a lot of Sudanese, I think, feel right now, from my understanding. As you say, there was a huge amount of hope when these protests erupted in 2018, 2019. They were protests against the cost of living, but also against the rule of the ex-president Omar al-Bashir, who essentially ruled Sudan for 30 years according to a political logic based on transactional patronage politics. And it really drove the country, into the ground. And what these protests did was they created the conditions, the circumstances in which Omar al-Bashir was ousted. But they themselves were not the ones that directly ousted him. He was actually ousted by the military and the RSF. So in effect, it was a kind of palace coup. And that happened in April 2019. So the question then became, who should rule Sudan? Originally, the military and the RSF were like, we should, and they took over. But there was a lot of pressure, internal and international, and it led in 2019 to the formation of a transitional power-sharing government between the military on the one hand and the RSF, and on the other hand between civilian political parties. And this was this kind of power-sharing arrangement was supposed to steer Sudan to elections. And particularly kind of international diplomats in the international community, they're very, very happy with it. They were like, this is a great arrangement. You know, we don't have to disqualify these, you know, army generals and militia leaders because, you know, if we did, they'd be really unhappy and it would be civil war. And these civilian political parties were involved too. You know, they were driven by this kind of realpolitik and pragmatism, and they were quite happy. There was one group that was a lot more skeptical, and that group was essentially the Sudanese, like the grassroots Sudanese pro-democracy movement, represented largely through the so-called, well, through the resistance committees, which are these neighborhood organizations that exist in neighborhoods across Sudan. There are thousands and thousands of them. They were the ones that organized the protests that uprooted Omar Bashir. And we'll get onto the incredible work that they're doing right now. But they were basically saying, you know, these military generals, they don't want democracy. You know, we talked about all their economic interests, all their political interests. They own like large amounts of the economy, and there's all this dark money kind of floating around. They're benefiting on gold, all this kind of stuff. They don't want democracy, and this is what, you know, many Sudanese felt. And the international diplomats, they were like, you know, it's okay, it's okay. But the international diplomats proved to be wrong. In October 2021, as this transition process continued, the military and the RSF put an end to it. They ousted their civilian counterparts that they had dominated all along, for what it's worth, but they ousted them in a coup in October 2021. A coup that was fundamentally designed because they didn't want democracy, they didn't want accountability. All of these things don't work in their interests. Sudanese hit the streets again, and this time the message was very clear. They did not want any negotiations between civilians and the army. So they said no to negotiations with the army. The army must return to the barracks. The militias must be dissolved. This was the message that came through. They were overlooked. They were excluded. The international diplomats focused on stitching together this arrangement of civilians and military and trying to get this kind of alliance back together. That's what their kind of focus was on over the last sort of 6-7 months. There was a huge amount of pressure to do it. It was a botched kind of process. It was rushed. Towards the end of last year, an agreement, a sort of tentative framework agreement was signed. And this led to consultations in January, February of this year, February, March, I can't quite remember the precise dates, with an aim to getting a new civilian military transitional government kind of underway, civilian-led government, you know, these kind of terms we used. But it broke down. The talks were really rushed, and it broke down especially on this issue of security sector reform. For the uninitiated, that basically means, how do you form a unified army in a country like Sudan? So the idea was the RSF, they need to be part of the army under one command and control. And this was kind of disputed. The RSF wanted it to happen over 10 years or even longer because they feared that their autonomy, their wealth, all their power would be lost. The army was like, no, let's do it in 2 years. And this crystallized and sort of turbocharged all of these tensions that, you know, we've been describing and talking about that stretched back for so many years. It led to troop movements in the capital, and then on April 15th, the war broke out. It was a war that Sudanese had seen coming, many Sudanese had seen coming and warned against. They said, if you empower the generals, these war criminals, if you legitimize them, they're not reform-minded, your pragmatism will lead us down the wrong path. And I mean quite clearly that the Sudanese resistance committees and the Sudanese protest movements were really kind of vindicated. I would just add very, very briefly that the same kind of international diplomats and donors committed Sudan to a really unpopular economic reform model that followed neoliberal prescriptions, namely spending cuts for the government, that created more poverty, more hardship, and made the transition even more unworkable. We haven't quite gone into the role of regional, the region, Egypt and Saudi Arabia and UAE. That's a whole really relevant as well. But I think that hopefully explains a little bit about the transition process.
Yeah, and in fact, this power sharing thing seems to clearly be that the international community pushed seems to be quite unpopular. We have Zainab in the comments saying this concept of power sharing is a myth. It's a ticking bomb. Sorry, and we published on the new Humanitarian website a few days ago a really powerful first-person essay from Hala Al-Karib, who's the regional director of SIHA, which is a feminist network in the Horn of Africa, who was also, speaking quite forcefully and vividly against this idea that power sharing could ever work for the people of Sudan. So, someone, I'm sorry, I can't see your name here, imagining allowing rebel group who were once rebels paid to commit crimes a seat to rule the country. Yeah. So now that we've got the sorry, the comments just keep coming. I for some reason I can't see the names, but someone's saying it's funny how the international diplomats derided resistance committees for refusing to negotiate with the military, yet the RCs, resistance committees, I suppose, have now been shown to be one of the only actors in the accurate analysis of the military's intentions.
Exactly. You say the strength of this feeling is really this needs to be a turning point in terms of how are these kind of agreements made, how are peace agreements structured, how is power sharing done, questioning the kind of attitudes of international diplomats when it comes to dealing with military generals. There was this sense that for them it was easier to deal with these establishment actors in uniform than it was to deal with this incredibly decentralized resistance committees that they didn't really understand, because they represented politics, political ideas that are probably anathema to how they see the world.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean the political agenda of the resistance committees. They're arguing for fundamental structural change in the country, and I don't think that's the same position as a lot of the kind of outside powers that have a stake in Sudan, whether that's regional or whether that's Western countries who are much more interested in normalizing. They wanted the Sudanese transition to normalize ties with Israel. They wanted an economic reform program that was essentially a neoliberal one. These were their interests, not necessarily fundamental changes and egalitarian changes in Sudan.
And we'll talk a little bit later on about kind of what's happening from the grassroots and a different approach, because you've done some really interesting reporting and writing about what's happening, especially in Darfur, with local intervention. But first, just to kind of finish establishing, what the situation is in Sudan today. As I mentioned at the start, it's largely disappeared from the headlines already, at least where I'm sitting in London. And I think where a lot of people are, except for Sudan and their immediate neighbors. Does that mean that the conflict has abated, is any less vivid than it was, a month ago?
No, I think it's the opposite. It seems to be getting worse. I think some international media have moved on, and sadly that's par for the course in terms of how they cover global conflict and the kind of the hierarchy there. But no, the situation is very, very, very dire. Pretty much as soon as the conflict started, there have been these ceasefires that have been brokered, and the RSF and the army have committed to, but their word essentially means nothing, and they've broken down immediately because they were never designed to be kept. They were just attempts to kind of pacify and mollify, international kind of diplomats and mediators. The two sides met in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia last week. They agreed to respect the international humanitarian law, which they should have been doing already, and open humanitarian corridors. That hasn't transpired. These two sort of conflicting parties have very different kind of fighting styles. The Sudanese army has the air power, and that's that's its essential, its war strategy right now in Khartoum, in the capital city. The RSF has fought all these wars in the peripheries for many, many years. It's a very capable kind of street fighting force that moves around on Toyota kind of Land Cruisers with machine guns, and essentially, you know, they have embedded themselves in neighborhoods, in people's houses, in hospitals, in residential areas in Khartoum, all across. And they're controlling, from what I understand, talking to our journalists, our Sudanese colleagues that are on the ground right now, they're controlling large parts of the capital, if not, almost all of it. And they are very much in control. And for the Sudanese army, it's so reliant on kind of air power that if it really wants to, root out the RSF from Khartoum, we're talking about, destroying like a large amount of the city. It would be horrendous, the humanitarian toll and the cost to an amazing, flourishing capital city. It would be huge. Right now, the RSF is, committing horrifying abuses. We're hearing horrifying stories coming out from the residential neighborhoods in Khartoum, including sexual abuse, women and girls. The military is dropping artillery and sort of indiscriminate fire that's hitting hospitals and other buildings, and affecting kind of civilians, really badly. This is a city, by the way, Greater Khartoum. I think the numbers may be a bit contested, but 7 million people. And it's not just Khartoum that's being affected, it's also Darfur as well, significantly in the Sudan westernmost region. We'll come on to talk about Darfur maybe in a bit, but Darfur is also being very, very badly impacted. And the conflict has taken a slightly different turn there, insofar as it's not just the RSF against the army, but it's grafted onto and mapped onto more local forms of conflict. So you have RSF-aligned Arab militias essentially fighting against the non-Arab Masalik group of West Darfur. And this is, I haven't been able to collate the numbers, but it seems to me that more people are actually dying in one town in West Darfur than they are in Khartoum right now. That's how bad the situation is in the town of El Geneina in West Darfur, where this conflict is kind of centered and focused right now. So yeah, it's really bad, and maybe I can get into the kind of the more humanitarian consequences of that in a bit. But
yeah, let's, because we saw a lot of images in the beginning, especially of people fleeing. And that's certainly one part of the humanitarian situation. But many more are stuck where they are, and in the city of Khartoum, where the fighting is happening, in people's homes, in a major capital city. Wafa says the security is completely lost in Khartoum, and healthcare facilities are mostly all out of service. We had someone earlier ask if whether the airport has reopened. I do want to point out, if you missed the beginning, Philip is in Abidjan, not in Khartoum, so we're only able to say, what we've heard recently from reporters on the ground, rather than being able to give you first-hand information. But it is a question that's come up. Another question that's coming up from Luan Deda asks, there's talk of involvement of other forces such as Russians in this conflict. Any insight on international influences? And Sylvester is following up that question with, if there are external forces in this conflict, what are their interests? Is that something that you can speak to, that you've heard about?
Yeah, I can speak to it a little bit. In terms of Khartoum Airport, I don't think it's operational right now. There's been talk of an African Union kind of peacekeeping force securing Khartoum Airport, but I don't know what the sort of the status of that, and how easy it would be for the AU to get such a force operational. Right now, the kind of main hub, at least for aid operations, is in Port Sudan in the east, and that's become a kind of de facto capital, as Khartoum is in major conflict. But again, maybe we can come on to that. In terms of the international kind of interest and influences, I do think there is a tendency to overstate in a lot of conflicts in Africa the role of Russia and the role of the Wagner Group, and I think that can be a bit problematic. Certainly, it's been around in Sudan since 2017, exploiting gold, and showing interest in construction of a Russian naval base in the Red Sea. Yeah, there's been some reports that they may be supporting Hemeti in this conflict. Hemeti's RSF controls most of the gold in Sudan, but the real kind of heavies in this conflict, regional heavies, are Egypt. Egypt supports the Sudanese army. That seems fairly clear. It sees the army as is in its image, and it has an understanding of kind of security in which it thinks military institutions are the guarantors of security, and so it supports the Sudanese army, even despite its kind of hostility and antipathy towards political Islam, and there are obviously Islamist influences within the Sudanese armed forces. Hemeti appears to be getting weapons and supplies from General Haftar in Libya, and that presumably would be something that is happening with the UAE's blessing, though it seems like there are different princes in the UAE supporting different sides, so it's very complex. Saudi Arabia, I think, has kind of fingers in the different pies too, and I think I've already kind of spoke a little bit to what I think the interest and influences of the sort of like Western donors and diplomats are too, but certainly there is a lot of kind of like outside intervention and outside interference that has dashed Sudanese democratic aspirations in the past and is inflaming this conflict going forward too. And if there is to be a mediated settlement, I think certainly the UAE and Egypt are going to need to put pressure on both sides.
Yeah, and we have a comment from Julia Pagani, who is a humanitarian professional based in Khartoum, maybe evacuated now. I'm not sure whether you're in Khartoum right now, Julia, but says that, yes, Philip, you were right on the West Darfur death toll, which is skyrocketing in El Geneina. From a Sudanese news outlet, says that the attacks on the capital of West Darfur, ongoing for 21 days, have claimed at least 2,000 lives and injured thousands of others. And those, again, are probably underestimated numbers, the numbers that are coming out of Darfur. And Wafa says there's no electricity, which makes it very hard to secure houses during the nighttime, and water is disconnected from most of the Khartoum neighborhoods, especially in the Bahri area, which I saw the map earlier, is just across the water. Yes, Julia's back in Europe. Good. Glad you're safe. So speaking of humanitarian situation and humanitarian reaction, there's one question that I wanted to put to you, which is, what has been the humanitarian response? And we're going to talk in a minute about the local response. We're going to start with the kind of international organizations. We had another first-person essay published on the newhumanitarian.org from a Sudanese humanitarian professional, which was quite scathing about the international community's response as quote unquote missing in action. So what's been happening on that front?
Yeah, thank you. This was a devastating conflict, and international humanitarian agencies have a duty of care, obviously, to their staff. And so the initial kind of focus of those agencies was, how do we get foreign nationals out of the country and how do we relocate national staff too? There are kind of problems with that approach, obviously, but that was kind of their initial response from the sort of interviews and reporting that I did. But, for a lot of Sudanese, that was, I think, something that's quite hard to swallow. The conflict is suddenly erupting and you're seeing the aid agencies who have all the resources to respond, suspending their programs, evacuating their staff and scaling down their activities. And I think that led to this feeling, as diplomatic embassies were also closed and shuttered, and international media focused on foreign nationals and the plight of foreign nationals, I think this all led to a sense of complete abandonment. And I think, I think that's completely understandable. Right now, for international agencies, certainly, WFP is starting to, reopen its program. There is a humanitarian kind of logistics hub that's now been set up in Port Sudan. There's a coordination hub, I think, in Nairobi. They're looking at opening a kind of some kind of like logistics hub in Chad on the border with Darfur to try and do a kind of cross-border operation. There are distributions that are happening in different places to internally displaced people. Even within Darfur, it's happening. So things are starting to sort of scale up, of course. But I think it's really important to say that the response to this conflict has not been led by international humanitarian agencies. It has been led by the Sudanese, the same Sudanese resistance committees and volunteer organizations that have been central to the sort of political situation in Sudan for the past few years. They are organizing WhatsApp groups to tell local communities in Khartoum what bakeries are open, where you can get medical supplies. They are monitoring and tracking the streets to figure out, when someone can safely leave, what streets are okay to use at what moments. They are organizing, they're organizing food distributions, medical support, everything. You have Sudanese doctors, they're staying behind in Khartoum as their hospitals are bombed and occupied by the RSF. They have not left. And so really this has to be another, one of those moments where, the international donors that control the purse strings have to think who is best placed to respond to the needs of the Sudanese right now. And I can't right now see international aid agencies being able to launch a serious humanitarian response in a place like Khartoum or in El Geneina. Even in Darfur, getting supplies all the way from Port Sudan to El Geneina or to Niala or Al Fasher, the other towns in Darfur, this is like the equivalent distance of London to Warsaw, as the contributor pointed out in the op-ed that she wrote on Monday. So who's on the ground? Who's best able to respond? It's the Sudanese resistance committees. And I'm not best placed at TNH to try and analyze how the kind of international aid bureaucracy might be able to do something like that. It's very, very difficult and challenging because it's such a bureaucratic system. But certainly this conversation needs to be had about how some of this money can be dispersed to the organizations that are in need. And Sudanese diaspora organizations certainly are chipping in right now, fundraising, getting money over to doctors. They need cash, they need fuel, they need medicine, they need everything they can get. I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Yeah. And so Zainab very aptly says humanitarian agencies owe a duty of care not only to their employees, but also to those in need where they are based and deployed. They all failed. And certainly can understand that sentiment when you're on the ground. And Mauro Costa is asking, any news on how humanitarian interventions can work without banks open? Yeah, as you were just pointing out, that is the challenge within those organizations.
Yeah, it's one of many challenges right now. From conversations I've had, is cash. Banks are non-operational. Markets are disrupted. That means that the cost of doing business is skyrocketing for aid agencies, just as the cost of living is skyrocketing even beyond what it already was for Sudanese. So that's one of the big questions right now, is how aid agencies can get that cash kind of circulating. Honestly, I'm just afraid to say I haven't reported from the perspective of international aid actors for the last week or two, so I don't quite know how they're answering that question. All I can confirm is that it is a big challenge that they're facing, and then it's also about they most of their national staff are on the ground and ready to work in many cases, and they have their own needs, they have their families' needs to take care of too. How do you pay them? This was certainly a big issue that was seen in the Tigray conflict in northern Ethiopia over the last few years, in terms of the ability of aid agencies to get cash in and pay their own staff, pay suppliers, all of this kind of stuff to do that emergency humanitarian work. So a big issue, it seems. Yeah.
So we'll talk in a second. Wafa says that banks are partially open outside Khartoum, by the way. We're going to get to the question, the thing we've been mentioning from the beginning, which is the local initiatives you've been reporting on in Darfur, but we keep getting interrupted by really interesting questions. And that there was one from Sudar Sono asking, and we were just talking about this before we started the live stream, so I really would like you to make that point publicly. How close is Sudan to civil war? can we call this civil war?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we were discussing this just before. Honestly, like my assumption kind of has always been that the civil war is not necessarily like a value term that is particularly kind of morally loaded. I always saw it as just a kind of like, I mean, I guess it is of course loaded, but I always saw it as if, you know, there's big conflict in a country, you could probably call it a civil war. But I think, yeah, it certainly seems that neither side here, the Sudanese army or the rapid support forces, has much of a social base or a constituency. Both of them are incredibly unpopular. Nobody really wants them involved in politics. And so right now it's kind of a conflict between these two sides that no one supports. And so to call it a sort of a civil war, I understand that a lot of Sudanese have been kind of resisting that. And so, you know, it's interesting to hear that perspective. I do think there is that risk that as the conflict continues and evolves, that it could turn into a much more complex, multi-sided battleground. And, you know, we're already starting to see that to some extent in Darfur, in which the kind of national level conflict overlaps with more localized kind of conflict. And we're also seeing it insofar as, you know, the Sudanese army is trying to, you know, peel away components of Hemeti, who's the leader of the RSF, components of Hemeti's Arab Rizaigat community, namely Musa Hilal. Some readers some listeners might be familiar with that name. I'm sure they are. You also have all these Darfuri Arab rebel movements. Right now, they've stayed fairly neutral. They're probably facing quite a bit of pressure, though, to pick sides, from what I'm understanding. You know, we're talking about Mini Manawi, we're talking about the Justice and Equality Movement, all these organizations in Darfur. What side do they pick? And if they do start picking sides, does this conflict become, you know, more polarizing, more potentially ethnicized, and might that look more like a kind of protracted, multi-sided, very complex civil war? It's hard to say right now, and I think if you look at what's happening in Darfur and the local initiatives that maybe I can come on and speak about, I think the push is maybe in the opposite direction in terms of this you know, this real resistance to the war, real resistance to conflict that is evident through this, you know, resistance committees, but also evident through what communities are doing in Darfur.
Yes, and let's get to that, because what you're describing is in your reporting on Darfur is people essentially refusing the logic of war, refusing trying to interfere and interrupt that logic of war before it settles in and becomes this potentially, you know, ongoing, protracted conflict.
Yeah, you know, I've been on the phone to people in Darfur almost, you know, like a lot over the last sort of 2 weeks. I've been speaking to a lot of people, and there is this sense, I think, that for Darfur is like this war is not like a new thing. You know, they've been facing conflict and war for the last 20 years, and it might be new to Khartoum. Khartoum might not have experienced something like this for the last 100 years, but it's not so new to them. And there is this kind of feeling that they don't, you know, a lot of Darfuris just don't want another destructive war. Very, very, very briefly, because it is very complicated. But, you know, in the early 2000s, as I said at sort of the beginning, Darfur's, you know, communities in Darfur rose up against the government of Omar al-Bashir. They, you know, citing marginalization, citing neglect. And these rebel groups were mainly from the sort of non-Arab communities of Darfur, the Fur, the Masalit, the Zagawa. Omar al-Bashir responded by arming Arab insurgents, the Janjaweed, that are now the RSF. And this caused untold havoc. And when I was in Darfur, you know, recently, this conflict, you know, is still very, very, very visceral, insofar as the militias are still attacking people, and insofar as there are still 1.4 million, I think, displaced people from that conflict, mostly non-Arab Janjaweed victims that are still living in displacement camps. So that conflict never really ended, and there's a lot of fear that if the RSF loses Khartoum or withdraws from Khartoum, they will go to Darfur, because that's their stronghold. And then Darfur turns into the epicenter of the conflict once again. And right now, communities, you know, leaders, whether it's university professors, women's groups, youth groups, you know, religious leaders, members of the native administration, you know, community leaders essentially, they are trying to stop this from happening. And so what we've seen almost since the second day of the conflict, I think, in the capitals of the different Darfur states, so that's Al Fasher, El Dain, Zelinji, Niala, is community leaders broker ceasefires between the RSF and the Sudanese army. And they are more or less holding in everywhere but El Geneina. And they are holding as the national negotiations in Jeddah with the US and all these, fancy international diplomats come to nothing. And so, I mean, you can question these local ceasefire efforts, and a lot of the journalists and civil sort of society activists that I'm talking to in Darfur think that the ceasefires are holding because it is in the military advantage of the different sides. And it's kind of complex, and it changes from town to town to understand the politics of the town and why there might be a ceasefire. They don't think that if orders come from Khartoum to start the fighting, that the local commanders of the two sides will have any option. All of this, I think, might well be true, but certainly I think it shows, and this is the message that I'm really hearing from Darfuri professors, activists, journalists that I've been speaking to. This shows the kind of spirit of the Sudanese, and it shows the determination of certainly Darfuris to as you said, Isabelle, to resist this kind of logic of war. And it kind of suggests that it's not going to be easy for either of these two sides, the RSF and the army, to instrumentalize community grievances, to instrumentalize local tensions, and to try and win people over to their sides, because a lot of people don't want this. The majority of people obviously don't want this to happen, this war.
What are they telling them to make these ceasefires work when in Khartoum those conversations aren't going anywhere? What's their different approach?
Yeah, I mean, it varies. Really interesting to try and understand this. And I've been speaking to some of the mediators in the last few days. A few different things, essentially. Number one, this is if it's religious leaders leading it, it's that this is not religious. Like, this is not acceptable. We're all brothers, and sisters. Stop. This is not allowed. This has clearly been a message that they put to the two sides. The other, which I think is kind of interesting and speaks to this idea that Darfur never stopped the conflict, but Khartoum, where it's new to Khartoum, is that they've basically been saying, if you want to fight this war, if you want they're saying this to the RSF, if you want to fight this war, if you want regime change, please don't do it here. Please do it in Khartoum. So that's kind of the message that they're offering. It's like, don't fight in Niala, don't fight in Zalinji, don't fight in Al Fasher. There has been, I don't think, very much fighting in Zalinji for what it's worth. But don't fight in Al Fasher, don't fight in Niala. You won't win the conflict here. Do it somewhere else. And then that feeds into the third message that I've heard from the governor of Al Fasher and from the religious leaders that negotiated it in Niala. The third message is we've suffered enough. We've suffered enough in Darfur. And it's you that will be suffering too if this war continues here. So please stop. And you could be skeptical about whether this will work, but I think it's important to foreground the agency of communities that get caught in conflict and the efforts that they make to try and resist those objects of conflict. And I haven't seen much international media focus on the efforts of Darfuri mediators. I have seen a lot more focus on the efforts of US and Saudi mediators in Jeddah.
Yeah, and I think that's important. And please continue sending your questions. We have a few more minutes to get to them, and I'll ask the last two that just came through. But before we do that, I'd like to kind of hammer on that point, because everything we've talked about today is based on the reporting that we've been able to commission as the New Humanitarian and that you've been editing. And I wonder if you could speak to, what our ongoing coverage is going to look like, and sort of what are you trying to tease out on the angle that you're trying to take to covering what's happening in Sudan.
Yeah, thanks, Isabelle. I mean, I think primarily, first and foremost, vast numbers of people are leaving Sudan right now. They're leaving to Egypt, they're leaving to Chad, they're leaving to South Sudan, they're leaving to Ethiopia, they're leaving to Saudi Arabia, and they're facing obstacles left, right, and center. We've already tried through our reporting to kind of explain what some of those obstacles are, whether it's visa restrictions, obstacles to claiming asylum, or just, really, terrible conditions on the border, the Chadian border, and terrible conditions awaiting returnees, South Sudanese returnees who are leaving Sudan, having taken refuge there from South Sudan's war. I think moving ahead, I think it would be great for journalists. We will certainly be trying to do this at the New Humanitarian to focus on, what are the obstacles people are facing outside Sudan, getting asylum, building new lives, building temporary lives, whatever it might be, integrating into communities. What are the obstacles people are going to face? This is, let's not just report on that initial exodus and then stop. And then I think, people that are leaving Sudan right now, not necessarily the case in Darfur, but certainly maybe from Khartoum, the people that are leaving, as has been stressed, are those who have the means to do so. Millions of people are still in Khartoum, clearly trapped, and vast numbers of people are internally displaced too. So, what conditions and situations await internally displaced people in Sudan and people that are still trapped by conflict? Let's make sure that, as media, that obviously Sudanese media is covering this already. I'm speaking really about international, global media. Let's make sure that that's not forgotten. And then, as I said, while reporting on the dynamics of the violence and the dynamics of the conflict and on how it impacts civilians, let's also make sure we reflect the agency of civilians in conflict, which includes, in Sudan's case, this astonishing humanitarian effort from the resistance committees, and also includes, the efforts of, say, community leaders in Darfur to broker local negotiations. These are just two small examples, but I think, we'll continue to try and to foreground those efforts too.
Absolutely, and I invite people to check out thenewhumanitarian.org and sign up for our newsletters to get more of that coverage. I shared a few links in the comments. I think particularly our first person essays, where we're able to center the voices of people in Sudan, have been and coverage by our Sudanese freelancers on the ground. It's just been just incredibly vivid and touching and important. To your point about the ceasefires in Darfur, Shayna, who's a Sudan researcher in transitional justice, adds that it's also interesting to note that the RSF and ACF troops are heavily recruited from the peripheries like Darfur and Kordofan, and could explain why they don't want to, fire on people from their own areas, essentially. We have a few more questions, 3 more questions. Let's try and take them in chronological order. And this is a quick one. Sudar Sono is just asking if we can confirm the numbers that he's seen, which is at least 1,000 people have been killed, more than 5,000 others injured. Is that true? Probably yes, probably an undercount, correct?
Yeah, I'd say a vast undercount. A vast undercount. We keep hearing reports from Khartoum, from Darfur of bodies being left on streets. I think a vast undercount.
Next question is, Moro is asking, is any international actor looking at stopping artillery and especially ammunitions from flowing into Sudan? If we're realistic, if the armed actors have bullets, they'll keep shooting. And the huge risk is what almost nobody is talking about yet. It is the active intervention in the conflict by other rebel actors across Sudan. You did mention that earlier, the possibility of other groups aligning themselves with one side or the other. But what about ammunitions and weapons flowing into Sudan?
Yeah. So the rebel groups, that's a really active question, and will really structure probably the conflict as it moves forward. That right now, though, a lot of the Darfuri rebel movements seem to be staying neutral. Can that last? I don't know. On efforts to sort of stop arms and munitions kind of flowing, I really don't think that, the US government, say, in terms of its sanctions regime, has not yet sanctioned Hemeti and Burhan, let alone, done anything public to prevent weapons flows from, UAE and Egypt. Like that's a hard thing to pull off. Whether those kind of diplomatic channels or kind of diplomatic efforts have started, I don't know. But I definitely think that if this conflict is going to come to an end, those regional powers that are providing the backing for these two sides are going to have to be on board and are going to have to lead the efforts. The danger there, though, and I think it's a good point to close on, is that if there is a negotiation between the two sides, and I think that's perhaps a long way off, like a genuine negotiation, I think that's a way off, because one side would need to be weak for the other side to want to do it, or for them to want to do it, rather. But if there are negotiations, who are these negotiations going to be between? They're going to be between the RSF and the army. What are they going to want? Power. Like, at the most, maybe they'll agree to, restarting the transition. That's what both of them are saying, the civilian military transition. But then we're in the same place then the Sudanese are in the same place that they were, before this conflict started. So negotiations need to stop overlooking the resistance committees, and they need to stop overlooking the main force of democratic change in Sudan. And whatever peace agreement, in inverted commas, is produced from this, if it entrenches the power and legitimacy of two military generals that the vast majority of Sudanese don't want, according to the same logic that has been used, the same diplomatic logic that's been used in Sudan for the last few years since Bashir's ouster, it will not work. Yeah.
Well, this could be our conclusion, except that we keep getting questions and we still have 8 minutes on the clock. So I'm going to use all of your time that we have to keep taking audience questions. And since you mentioned mediation and sanctions, two kind of related questions I'm asking, is there any distinct international actor that's actively involved in mediation right now? Are there talks happening? Is someone involved in mediating those? And about sanctions, Julia asked if there isn't a risk of sanctions subtly impacting on civilians, given that the army and the economy are so intertwined.
Yeah.
Yes to both.
The first question, talks are happening in Saudi Arabia, in Jeddah. The talks are happening between the two sides. That's being kind of led by the US and by Saudi Arabia. So far, it's just been a kind of commitment to respect humanitarian norms, not a genuine ceasefire. We have seen many ceasefire agreements since this conflict. It's unbelievable to think it's only a month old for the number of ceasefires that have already been agreed to.
And broken. Yeah.
None of them, potentially by design. None of them have functioned at all. On the implications of like, say, a US sanction regime, if they were to sanction Hemeti and Burhan, how that would impact Sudan's economy, I'm afraid I just you raise a really interesting point. I'm just not sure I can answer it right now. I'm definitely skeptical about the role of sanctions generally to ending conflict. Skeptical about the amount of leverage the US thinks it might have in this conflict. I think the leverage is with the regional powers like Egypt and the UAE, not with the US. But the economic control that the military and the RSF have on the Sudanese people is not to the benefit of the Sudanese people. Like it's created a completely perverse political economy that basically takes vast amounts of resources and puts it in the hands of like a military industrial complex. So ways and efforts to dismantle that, I think, would ultimately be, I think it's completely necessary and essential to whatever negotiations follow. But yeah.
And the final question that I'll put to you, and I mean, we did touch on it earlier, but I think it's an important one to conclude on. It's from Isabelle asking, do you see a risk that the situation in Sudan will be quote unquote forgotten? And we certainly cover a lot of those crises here at TNH, and what will happen when the global headlines do fade, and they are starting to fade already.
Yeah, I'm a bit, as Isabelle probably knows, I'm a bit skeptical of the kind of forgotten crisis framing, just insofar as forgotten to who. It's definitely not going to be forgotten to the Sudanese. It's definitely not going to be forgotten to neighboring countries. It's definitely not going to be forgotten to the regional powers that have, that are playing they're playing a pretty malign influence right now. I don't think Sudan was forgotten over the last few years by international actors and outside powers. I think there were active interventions in Sudan, and I think they thwarted the democratic ambitions of the Sudanese. So I don't think the problem is that Sudan has been forgotten in a sense. If we're talking about international media headlines specifically, I think that unfortunately, I think that's just that is inevitable. Because in a sense, you know, what even is international media? You have the New York Times that's writing to an American audience, that's done great reporting on Sudan over the last few weeks. I don't know why I mentioned the New York Times, but just saying, you know, they have an American audience primarily. You know, the Guardian is a UK audience. You know, it will be covered less and less, which I think is fairly inevitable. And also, you know, the more complex and convoluted conflicts become, the less coverage they normally get. And this is kind of backed up by research, you know, conflicts that are kind of like have this kind of easy, but usually incorrect, but easy kind of good versus bad, good versus evil kind of narrative and have clear kind of lines tend to get quite a lot of media attention. Conflicts that become drawn out, protracted, multi-sided, tend to get less. So certainly, like we at the New Humanitarian are not going to be forgetting about Sudan anytime soon. Yeah.
Certainly. Well, thank you so much, Philip. I learned tons, and I really appreciate your time and your expertise. Again, everyone watching, please check out thenewhumanitarian.org. You can sign up for our newsletters, and you can see all of our coverage of Sudan and other crises and humanitarian policy. Thank you to everyone for your really engaged participation. It was amazing to get so many questions and comments. We didn't even get to all of them. Thank you especially to Wafa and Zainab. It was lovely to just get a perspective from Sudan or from Sudanese diaspora. I think that was really, really valuable. And thank you to everyone who shared their professional expertise as well in the aid sector. We'll certainly be doing more of those. So follow the New Humanitarian on LinkedIn or on YouTube and sign up for the newsletter, and you'll be alerted of future ones. Thank you very much. Thanks, Philip. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye now.
Bye.